I want you to imagine walking through your local shopping mall at 2 a.m., when all the stores are closed, the lights are dimmed, and the only sound is the echo of your footsteps on the tile floor. Now imagine hearing other footsteps following you, but when you turn around, the corridor behind you is completely empty. That was my reality for 3 nights in October 2023, working overnight security at the Westfield Shopping Center in Sacramento, California, and those 3 nights changed my entire perspective on what lurks in abandoned retail spaces after the world goes to sleep. My name is Jake, I'm 25 years old, and until recently, I thought supernatural encounters were just stories people made up for attention or entertainment. I'd worked various security jobs since graduating high school, office buildings, construction sites, even a few residential complexes, but nothing had prepared me for what I would experience in that mall. The Westfield Shopping Center wasn't even technically abandoned. It was still operational during the day, but with about 60% occupancy and several large anchor stores that had been empty for over 2 years. The job posting had seemed straightforward. Overnight security guard, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 nights per week, $16 per hour. My responsibilities included walking patrol routes every hour, checking that all store gates were secure, monitoring the security camera feeds, and reporting any maintenance issues or suspicious activity. The mall management company, Hartwell Properties, had been very clear during my interview that the position was low intensity and mainly involved maintaining a visible presence to deter vandalism and break-ins. What they didn't mention was that 3 previous security guards had quit this position within the past 4 months, each lasting less than 2 weeks. I learned this detail from Ramon, the maintenance supervisor who trained me on my first day. Ramon had worked at the mall for 8 years and had seen dozens of security guards come and go, but the recent turnover rate was unusual even by his standards. Most guys just can't handle the isolation, Ramon explained, as he showed me the security office, a small windowless room in the mall's administrative corridor. It's different being alone in a place like this at night. Gets in your head, you know? All those empty stores, weird echoes, shadows moving where they shouldn't. Some people start seeing things that aren't there. The security office was equipped with 12 monitors displaying feeds from cameras throughout the mall, a radio system for communicating with local police if needed, and a logbook where I was supposed to record the time and location of each patrol round. The patrol route took me through all 3 levels of the mall, including the anchor store spaces that had been vacated by Sears and JCPenney. Those sections were kept locked and dark, but I was required to unlock them and check for signs of unauthorized entry twice per shift. My first night, Monday, October 16th, went smoothly enough. The mall was eerily quiet compared to the bustling daytime environment I was familiar with from shopping there occasionally, but nothing seemed genuinely threatening or supernatural. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows, and the fountains and decorative plants looked oddly surreal in the dim environment, but I attributed these feelings to the natural psychological effect of being alone in a large space designed to accommodate thousands of people. Let me know in the comments if you've ever worked alone in a large building at night, because the isolation does things to your mind that you can't fully understand until you experience it firsthand. The patrol routes were designed to take approximately 45 minutes to complete, leaving me with 15 minutes between rounds to monitor the security cameras and complete paperwork. I started my first patrol at midnight, walking slowly through the main corridors and checking that all store security gates were properly locked. Most of the storefronts were protected by metal mesh gates that could be unlocked from the outside, but not from within the stores, preventing someone from breaking in and then hiding inside until morning. The mall's layout was typical for shopping centers built in the 1980s. 3 levels connected by escalators and elevators, with wide corridors designed to accommodate heavy foot traffic and large anchor stores at each end. The ground level housed mostly clothing retailers, electronics stores, and a food court. The second level contained more specialized shops, services like hair salons and phone repair, and access to the movie theater that had closed permanently during the pandemic. The third level had originally been designed as office space, but had been converted to additional retail in the 1990s, though most of those stores had closed in recent years. Walking through these empty corridors, I began to understand why previous security guards might have found the environment unsettling. The mall's architecture created acoustic effects that made normal building sounds, ventilation systems, settling, water pipes, seem amplified and directional. Footsteps echoed off hard surfaces and seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The emergency lighting created pools of visibility separated by areas of deep shadow that could easily conceal someone moving parallel to the patrol route. But what struck me most during that first night was the smell. During operating hours, malls typically smell like a mixture of food court offerings, retail perfumes, and cleaning products. At night, with the ventilation systems running at minimum capacity, different odors became apparent. There was a mustiness that suggested poor air circulation in some areas, a chemical smell that might have come from cleaning supplies or carpet treatments, and underneath everything else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. The abandoned anchor stores were the most unsettling part of the patrol route. These large spaces, once filled with merchandise and customers, now stood completely empty, except for occasional pieces of abandoned retail fixtures. The Sears space still had some display cases and clothing racks scattered throughout, creating obstacle courses of shadows that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. The JCPenney space had been more thoroughly cleared, but the emptiness somehow felt more oppressive than the cluttered Sears area. It was in the abandoned JCPenney space that I first heard the sound that would define my brief career as a mall security guard. As I was walking through what had once been the cosmetics section, I heard what sounded like someone walking on the floor above me. The footsteps were clear and deliberate, with the distinctive click of hard-soled shoes on tile flooring. But the JCPenney anchor store was only one level high, and there was no floor above the area where I heard the sounds. I stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to determine if the sounds might be coming from the regular mall corridors on the second level, but the footsteps seemed to be directly overhead, moving in a pattern that suggested someone was walking back and forth in a space that I knew didn't exist. The sounds continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving me standing alone in the abandoned department store with my heart rate elevated and a growing sense that something was very wrong. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because what I experienced during my second patrol of that first night convinced me that the sounds weren't coming from the building's normal operations. My 2 a.m. patrol took me through the same route, but this time I approached the abandoned anchor stores with heightened alertness, and my flashlight held ready. The JCPenney space seemed different somehow, not in any way I could specifically identify, but the atmosphere felt heavier, more oppressive. As I entered what had been the main sales floor, I noticed that some of the abandoned display fixtures seemed to be positioned differently than they had been during my midnight patrol. This observation troubled me because I had been specifically instructed that no one else should be in the mall during my shifts. The cleaning crew finished their work by 10 p.m., and maintenance staff only entered the building during daytime hours unless there was an emergency. If someone was moving furniture in the abandoned stores, they were either authorized personnel who hadn't informed me of their presence or unauthorized intruders who had somehow bypassed the building's security systems. I decided to investigate more thoroughly, using my radio to contact the security company's dispatch center and report the possible presence of unauthorized individuals in the mall. The dispatcher confirmed that no maintenance or cleaning personnel were scheduled to be in the building during my shift and advised me to continue my patrol while remaining alert for signs of trespassing. As I moved more carefully through the JCPenney space, I began to notice other details that hadn't registered during my first patrol. There were scuff marks on the dusty floor that appeared to be fresh, suggesting that someone or something had recently moved through the area. More disturbing, there were what appeared to be handprints on some of the dusty surfaces, not clear enough to be useful for identification, but definitely indicating recent human contact. The discovery of evidence that someone had been in the abandoned store areas raised serious security concerns. If trespassers could enter and move around the mall without being detected by the camera systems, it suggested either technical problems with the surveillance equipment or knowledge of blind spots that would require insider information to exploit. I made detailed notes about the locations where I had found evidence of recent activity and planned to discuss the situation with mall management the following day. But as I was completing my inspection of the JCPenney space, I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer and more distinct. The sound was definitely coming from within the anchor store, not from any adjacent areas of the mall. Someone was walking approximately 30 feet away from my position, moving slowly and deliberately through the abandoned retail space. I could hear the footsteps clearly enough to determine that the person was wearing hard-soled shoes and walking with a measured, purposeful gait. I called out, "Security! Identify yourself!" and waited for a response. The footsteps stopped immediately, but there was no verbal reply. I moved toward the area where the sounds had originated, sweeping my flashlight beam ahead of me and continuing to call for identification. When I reached the location where I estimated the person had been standing, I found no one there. But the scuff marks in the dust were definitely fresh, and there was a lingering scent that reminded me of old cologne or aftershave. Subscribe for more terrifying workplace horror stories, because what happened during the final patrol of my first night made me question whether I was dealing with trespassers or something far more disturbing. Paragraph 2, 2,000 words. My 4 a.m. patrol on that first night was when I realized that whatever was happening in the mall wasn't a simple case of unauthorized trespassers. As I approached the abandoned anchor stores, I could see from a distance that something had changed significantly since my previous inspection. The display fixtures that I had noted were positioned differently were now arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns, not random scattering, but organized groupings that suggested intentional placement. More unsettling was the discovery that the scuff marks and handprints I had documented were no longer visible. The dusty surfaces appeared to have been cleaned or somehow restored to their previous unmarked condition, as if my earlier observations had been erased by some invisible custodial service. This finding was impossible to explain through normal means, as I had been monitoring the security cameras continuously between patrols and had seen no indication of anyone entering or leaving the abandoned store areas. I began to suspect that I was experiencing some form of psychological phenomenon, perhaps stress-induced hallucinations or false memories caused by the isolation and unusual environment. The alternative explanation, that supernatural forces were manipulating the physical environment while I was absent, seemed too unlikely to consider seriously. I made the decision to document everything more carefully, using my phone to take photographs of anything unusual and maintaining detailed written logs of all observations. As I entered the JCPenney space for my third inspection of the night, I immediately noticed that the temperature was significantly colder than it had been during previous patrols. The difference was dramatic enough that I could see my breath, despite the fact that the rest of the mall maintained a comfortable temperature through its climate control systems. The cold was concentrated in the area where I had heard footsteps earlier, creating a microclimate that suggested some form of localized cooling that couldn't be explained by the building's normal environmental systems. I used my phone to take photographs of the display fixture arrangements and temperature readings from the digital thermometer I had brought for documenting unusual conditions. As I was taking pictures, I began to hear what sounded like whispered conversation coming from deeper within the abandoned store. The voices were too distant and muffled for me to understand specific words, but the cadence and tonal patterns were unmistakably human speech. Moving toward the source of the voices, I called out standard security challenges. "This is mall security. This area is closed to the public. Please identify yourselves and explain your presence in this building." The whispered conversation stopped immediately, but I could hear movement suggesting that the speakers were repositioning themselves rather than leaving the area. I continued advancing toward where I had heard the voices, using my flashlight to sweep the area ahead of me while maintaining radio contact with the security company dispatch. What I found in the former customer service area of the JCPenney store challenged my understanding of what was possible within the normal boundaries of physical reality. The area was arranged as if for some kind of meeting or gathering. Display fixtures had been positioned to create a rough circle, with spacing that suggested seating for 6 to 8 people. The dust patterns on the floor showed clear indications that this arrangement had been recently created and used. Footprints, scuff marks, and areas where the dust had been disturbed in ways consistent with people sitting and moving around the makeshift seating area. But there was no one there. Despite the clear evidence of recent occupancy and the voices I had heard just minutes earlier, the space was completely empty of any human presence. I searched systematically through the entire customer service area and the adjacent sections of the store, but found no one hiding or attempting to avoid detection. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because the evidence I discovered next convinced me that I was dealing with something that couldn't be explained by conventional security concerns. In the center of the circle formed by the display fixtures, I found objects that had definitely not been there during my previous patrols. There were several small items that appeared to be personal possessions: a woman's earring, a man's wristwatch that had stopped at 11:47, a child's toy car, and what looked like a shopping list written in faded ink on yellowed paper. These items were arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental dropping. The shopping list was particularly disturbing because it was written in handwriting styles and mentioned products that seemed to be from several decades earlier. Items like Ovaltine, TV dinners, and phonograph records suggested that the list had been written in the 1960s or 1970s, but the paper and ink appeared to be much older than that. The list was signed "For Tommy's birthday party, love Mom," in handwriting that was faded but still legible. I photographed all of these items and their arrangement, then used my radio to report the discovery to dispatch. The response was immediate concern about potential evidence related to missing persons cases or criminal activity. I was instructed to avoid disturbing the scene and to wait for police officers to arrive and examine the items professionally. While waiting for law enforcement, I continued my patrol of the rest of the mall, but I found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on routine security tasks. The discovery of what appeared to be decades-old personal belongings, arranged in a ritualistic pattern within an abandoned department store, raised questions that I wasn't equipped to answer. Were these items related to historical incidents at the mall? Had someone been collecting and arranging objects with sentimental value for reasons I couldn't understand? The police officers who responded to my call were thorough and professional, but they were also clearly puzzled by what they found. Officer Martinez, who took the lead on examining the scene, had worked in Sacramento for 15 years and had never encountered anything quite like the arrangement in the JCPenney store. The items appeared to be genuine vintage objects rather than modern reproductions, but their condition was inconsistent with having been exposed to the elements or stored in an abandoned building for decades. "This is definitely weird," Officer Martinez told me as he bagged the evidence for further examination. "These items look authentic for their time periods, but they're in too good condition to have been sitting in this store since it closed. Someone had to have placed them here recently, but I can't figure out why or how they got access to genuine vintage objects." The investigation revealed that the mall's security systems had no record of anyone entering or leaving the abandoned anchor stores during my shift. The camera feeds showed me entering and leaving the areas during my patrols, but no other human figures were visible at any point. The electronic logs for the door access systems confirmed that no one had used key cards or codes to enter restricted areas during the overnight period. This technical evidence supported my observations that I had been alone in the mall throughout my shift, but it didn't explain the voices I had heard, the footsteps, the temperature changes, or the arrangement of vintage objects in patterns that suggested human activity. Officer Martinez suggested that I might be dealing with someone who had extensive knowledge of the building's security systems and was able to move through the mall using methods that avoided detection by the surveillance equipment. Let me know in the comments if you want me to investigate this further, because what happened during my second night of work convinced me that technical explanations weren't going to account for what I was experiencing in that mall. Tuesday night, October 17th, began with a briefing from Jim Hartwell, the mall's general manager, who wanted to discuss the previous night's incident and review security protocols. Mr. Hartwell had been informed about the police investigation and the discovery of vintage objects in the abandoned JCPenney store, but he seemed more concerned about potential liability issues than about the unexplained nature of the findings. "Look, Jake," he said as we sat in his office before my shift began, "I don't know what kind of elaborate prank someone is trying to pull here, but we can't have unauthorized people getting into the mall and leaving weird stuff around. It creates liability problems and makes us look like we can't secure our own property. I need you to be extra vigilant tonight and report anything unusual immediately, Mr." Hartwell also informed me that he had arranged for additional security cameras to be installed in the abandoned anchor stores, with feeds that would be monitored remotely by the security company's central station. This meant that any activity in those areas would be recorded and observed in real time by trained personnel who could dispatch assistance if needed. The enhanced surveillance gave me some confidence that I would be safer during my second night, but it also increased the pressure to perform effectively. If supernatural phenomena were occurring in the mall, they would now be documented by professional security personnel who could provide corroboration for anything I reported. If I was experiencing hallucinations or psychological problems, the additional monitoring would likely reveal that as well. My midnight patrol of Tuesday night was different from the first night in several important ways. The abandoned anchor stores felt less oppressive, almost as if whatever presence I had sensed the night before was aware of the additional surveillance and had withdrawn to avoid detection. The temperature was normal throughout the JCPenney space, and I heard no unexplained sounds or voices during my initial inspection. However, as I was completing my patrol of the regular mall corridors, I began to notice new forms of unusual activity. Several of the store security gates appeared to have been rattled or shaken, with metal mesh sections that were slightly bent out of their normal positions. The sounds were subtle but distinct, like someone testing the strength of the barriers without actually trying to break through them. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the mannequins in store window displays had been repositioned. The changes were subtle but unmistakable to someone who had walked the same route the previous night. A female mannequin in a clothing store window had been turned to face the corridor instead of facing into the store. A male mannequin in another display had been moved several feet to the left of its original position. A group of child mannequins in a toy store window had been arranged to appear as if they were looking directly at the corridor where I walked during patrols. These changes were particularly unsettling because the store windows were sealed from the outside and the gates protecting them were locked and secure. There was no apparent way for someone to access the interior of the stores to move the mannequins without triggering security alarms or leaving evidence of forced entry. Yet, the repositioning was clearly deliberate and recent, suggesting that someone or something had been able to manipulate objects within locked retail spaces. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments section, because what I discovered during my 2 a.m. patrol revealed that the activity in the mall was escalating beyond simple object manipulation. Paragraph 3, 2,000 words. The 2 a.m. patrol on my second night was when I encountered the most direct and undeniable evidence that something supernatural was actively inhabiting the mall. As I entered the main corridor on the second level, I immediately noticed that several of the overhead lights were flickering in synchronized patterns that couldn't be explained by normal electrical problems. The flickering wasn't random or intermittent. It followed specific sequences that repeated every 30 seconds, creating a visual rhythm that seemed intentionally communicative. More disturbing was the discovery that the mall's public address system had activated itself and was broadcasting sounds at very low volume. When I stopped to listen carefully, I could hear what sounded like the ambient noise of a busy shopping mall, crowds of people talking, children laughing, the general buzz of commercial activity. But these sounds were coming from the speakers at 2 a.m. in an empty mall, and according to the security office controls, the PA system was supposed to be completely shut down during overnight hours. I radioed the security company dispatch to report the anomalous PA system activity and request assistance with troubleshooting the electrical problems. The response I received was both immediate and alarming. The central monitoring station was also receiving audio feeds from the mall that didn't match what their cameras were showing. They could hear crowd sounds and commercial activity through the surveillance system's audio pickups, but their video feeds clearly showed empty corridors with only me moving through them. This technical confirmation that the supernatural activity was affecting electronic systems throughout the mall marked a turning point in how I understood what I was experiencing. This wasn't stress-induced hallucination or psychological problems caused by isolation. It was genuine paranormal phenomena that could be detected and recorded by multiple independent systems operated by trained security professionals. The dispatch coordinator, a woman named Patricia who had been monitoring mall security accounts for over 10 years, told me she had never encountered anything like the technical anomalies we were seeing. "Jake, I want you to know that we're taking this situation very seriously," she said over the radio. "Whatever is happening in that mall is affecting our equipment in ways that we can't explain, and we're documenting everything for further investigation." As I continued my patrol with the knowledge that the supernatural activity was being independently verified and recorded, I began to observe phenomena that I had probably been unconsciously ignoring during my first night. The sounds of the busy mall coming from the PA system weren't random crowd noise. They included specific conversations, store announcements, and even what sounded like music from the mall's entertainment events. More unsettling, the crowd sounds seemed to be responding to my presence in real time. When I entered certain sections of the corridor, the volume would increase as if more people were gathering in that area. When I stopped to examine something unusual, I could hear voices that seemed to be commenting on my activities. The conversations were too muffled to understand specific words, but the timing and directional qualities suggested that invisible crowds were observing and discussing my patrol activities. The mannequin repositioning that I had noticed earlier in the evening proved to be an ongoing phenomenon rather than a one-time occurrence. As I walked through the same corridors during my 2 a.m. patrol, I could see that several displays had been changed since my midnight inspection. The child mannequins in the toy store window had been rearranged again, this time positioned as if they were playing together in a group. The adult mannequins in clothing stores had been posed in more lifelike positions, with arms positioned as if they were reaching for merchandise or pointing toward other parts of the displays. But the most disturbing change was in the cosmetics section of the abandoned Sears store. During my midnight patrol, the area had been empty except for a few abandoned display cases and some scattered merchandise. During my 2 a.m. patrol, I found that someone or something had arranged the remaining cosmetic products to create what appeared to be a beauty salon setup, complete with mirrors positioned for customers and makeup, arranged as if for professional application. The setup was far too elaborate and detailed to have been created during the 2 hours between my patrols, especially given that the area was supposed to be under continuous surveillance by the newly installed camera system. When I radioed dispatch to report the cosmetics display, Patricia informed me that the cameras monitoring the Sears store had been experiencing technical problems since approximately 1:15 a.m., displaying only static and interference instead of clear video feeds. This pattern of electronic equipment malfunctioning in areas where paranormal activity was occurring suggested that whatever entities were inhabiting the mall were capable of disrupting surveillance systems to avoid being recorded. The sophistication required to selectively interfere with specific camera feeds while leaving others operational indicated intelligence and intentionality that went far beyond random supernatural phenomena. Let me know if you want a part 2 to this story, because what I experienced during my 4 a.m. patrol revealed the true nature of what was inhabiting the mall and why it seemed to be focused on retail and commercial activities. As I approached the abandoned anchor stores for my final patrol of the night, I could sense that the atmosphere had changed significantly since my earlier inspections. The air felt charged with energy, like the moment before a thunderstorm, and there was a subtle vibration that seemed to be coming from the ground itself. The temperature fluctuations I had experienced the previous night were back, but more extreme. Areas of intense cold alternating with zones of uncomfortable heat as I moved through the abandoned retail spaces. The JCPenney store, which had been the focus of most of the previous night's activity, now showed evidence of extensive rearrangement that went far beyond anything I had observed before. The display fixtures had been organized to create what appeared to be a complete retail environment, with merchandise sections, customer service areas, and even what looked like checkout stations complete with abandoned cash registers that had been arranged in functional configurations. But there was no merchandise. The retail environment had been constructed using only the abandoned fixtures and displays, creating the skeleton of a department store without any of the products that would normally be sold in such a space. It was as if someone or something was recreating the experience of shopping in a store that no longer existed, building a framework for commercial activity that could only be experienced by entities that didn't require physical products. Walking through this ghostly recreation of a functioning department store, I began to understand that I was witnessing something far more complex than random supernatural activity. The entities inhabiting the mall weren't just making noise or moving objects for the purpose of frightening security guards. They were actively attempting to recreate and maintain the commercial environment that had once thrived in this space. The sounds coming from the PA system began to make more sense in this context. The crowd noise, conversations, and store announcements weren't random recordings. They were the authentic sounds of the mall's commercial heyday, somehow preserved and replayed by entities that had been connected to those activities during their lifetimes. I was witnessing the supernatural continuation of shopping mall culture by spirits or ghosts who had been so attached to this retail environment that death hadn't severed their connection to it. This realization was both fascinating and terrifying. If the entities inhabiting the mall were former customers, employees, or others who had strong emotional connections to this commercial space, their intentions might not be malevolent, but their ability to manipulate physical objects and electronic systems suggested power that could become dangerous if they perceived threats to their continued residence in the mall. As I documented the elaborate retail setup in the abandoned JCPenney store, I began to hear the footsteps again, but this time they were accompanied by other sounds that painted a much clearer picture of what was happening. I could hear shopping carts moving across the tile floors, the electronic beeping of checkout scanners, the rustle of shopping bags, and the general acoustic signature of busy retail activity. But when I looked toward the sources of these sounds, I saw only empty space. The invisible commercial activity was happening all around me, but it existed in a dimension or reality that I could hear but not see. I was experiencing the supernatural echo of the mall's golden age, when this space had been filled with thousands of customers engaged in the social and economic activities that had once defined American retail culture. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because my discovery of who these entities had been in life and why they remained attached to the mall revealed a tragic story that made their supernatural persistence both understandable and heartbreaking. Paragraph 4, 2,000 words. My third and final night working at the mall began with a conversation that completely changed my understanding of what I had been experiencing. I had spent the day researching the history of the Westfield Shopping Center, and what I discovered about the building's past provided context that made the supernatural activity both more comprehensible and more disturbing. The mall had opened in 1982 during the height of American shopping center culture, and for nearly 2 decades, it had been the social and economic center of its suburban community. But its decline had been swift and tragic. In 2001, a fire in the food court had killed 3 people, an elderly man named Henry Morrison who had suffered a heart attack during the evacuation, a young mother named Lisa Chen who had been trapped by smoke inhalation, and a 7-year-old boy named Tommy Patterson who had been separated from his parents during the chaos. The mall had reopened after extensive renovations, but the fire had marked the beginning of a steady decline in business. Major anchor stores began closing in the mid-2000s. Foot traffic decreased dramatically, and by 2020 the center was operating at less than half capacity. The 3 deaths from the fire, combined with the economic decline of the retail industry, had created a perfect storm of tragic history and abandonment that often leads to supernatural activity in buildings with strong emotional resonances. More disturbing was my discovery that there had been other deaths associated with the mall over the years. In 1995, an employee named Margaret Vasquez had died of a heart attack while working alone in the Sears Cosmetics department during an overnight inventory shift. In 2008, a maintenance worker named Frank Thompson had been found dead at the bottom of an escalator shaft, apparently having fallen while performing repairs. In 2015, an elderly woman named Dorothy Kim had collapsed and died while shopping alone in the JCPenney store during regular business hours. These deaths, spread over more than 2 decades, had created a collection of souls with strong emotional connections to the mall who might be unable or unwilling to move on to whatever comes after life. The supernatural activity I had been observing began to make sense as the manifestations of people who had died in this retail environment and remained attached to the commercial activities that had been central to their final experiences. When I arrived for my Wednesday night shift on October 18th, I brought with me research materials about the mall's history and the people who had died there. I had also made the decision that this would be my final night on the job, regardless of what I encountered. The psychological stress of dealing with supernatural phenomena, combined with the tragic context of the deaths that had occurred in the building, made continuing in this position untenable for my mental health. Jim Hartwell was waiting for me in the security office when I arrived, and he looked more concerned than he had during our previous conversation. "Jake, I need to tell you that we're shutting down the overnight security position," he said, avoiding eye contact. "The incidents over the past 2 nights have created too much liability exposure for our insurance company, and frankly, the police reports are starting to attract unwanted attention from local media." I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment at this news. Relief because it meant I wouldn't have to spend another night alone with supernatural entities in an abandoned mall, but disappointment because it felt like running away from something that needed to be understood and possibly resolved. The spirits inhabiting the mall weren't malicious. They were just trying to continue existing in the only environment they had known and loved. "What about the people who died here?" I asked Mr. Hartwell. "Don't we have some responsibility to acknowledge their presence and maybe help them find peace?" He looked at me with the expression of someone who had been hoping to avoid exactly this type of conversation. "Jake, I don't know what you think you experienced in this building, but from a business standpoint, I can't have employees claiming that our mall is haunted. That kind of publicity would destroy what's left of our tenant relationships and probably force us into bankruptcy." This response made me realize that Mr. Hartwell was more concerned about protecting the mall's commercial reputation than addressing the supernatural phenomena that I had documented and that had been independently verified by professional security personnel. The entities inhabiting the mall were being dismissed and ignored, just as they had probably been marginalized and overlooked during their final days as living people. I decided to spend my final night trying to communicate directly with the spirits, to let them know that at least one person acknowledged their presence and understood their attachment to this retail environment. If they were going to be left alone in the abandoned mall after the security position was eliminated, the least I could do was offer them some form of recognition and respect for their continued existence. My midnight patrol on Wednesday was different from the previous nights because I approached it with the specific intention of making contact with the entities rather than simply documenting their activities. As I entered the abandoned JCPenney store, I spoke aloud to the empty space. "I know you're here, and I know who you are. I've learned about Henry Morrison, Lisa Chen, and Tommy Patterson from the fire. I know about Margaret Vasquez, Frank Thompson, and Dorothy Kim. You don't have to hide from me anymore." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The temperature dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the metal surfaces of the abandoned display fixtures. The PA system activated throughout the mall, broadcasting what sounded like dozens of voices trying to speak simultaneously. The lights began flickering in complex patterns that seemed to be attempting some form of visual communication. But most remarkably, I began to see them. Not clearly or consistently, but as translucent figures that appeared for a few seconds before fading back into invisibility. An elderly man in a cardigan sweater who I recognized from newspaper photos as Henry Morrison. A young woman pushing a stroller who matched descriptions of Lisa Chen. A small boy in a striped t-shirt who had to be Tommy Patterson. They weren't threatening or trying to frighten me. Instead, they seemed desperate to communicate, to share their stories, to maintain some connection with the world of the living. As I stood in that abandoned department store surrounded by the ghostly figures of people who had died in the mall over the past 2 decades, I realized that I was witnessing one of the most profound supernatural encounters that anyone had probably ever experienced. "I understand that you can't leave this place," I said to the assembled spirits. "This mall was important to you when you were alive, and death hasn't changed that connection. But you don't have to be afraid or hide anymore. I see you, and I know that you're still here." The response from the entities was emotionally overwhelming. The sounds coming from the PA system shifted from chaotic multiple voices to what sounded like expressions of gratitude and relief. The temperature began returning to normal, and the flickering lights settled into steady illumination that made the abandoned store feel warmer and more welcoming. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because what the spirits revealed to me about why they remained in the mall exposed a heartbreaking truth about modern society and what we lose when retail spaces die. Through a combination of visual manifestations, changes in environmental conditions, and sounds transmitted through the mall's electronic systems, the spirits began telling me their stories. Henry Morrison had been a regular customer at the mall for 20 years, coming every day to walk for exercise and socialize with other retirees in the food court. The mall had been his primary social environment, and when he died during the fire, his spirit remained attached to the only place where he had felt truly connected to his community. Lisa Chen had been a young mother who brought her son to the mall's playground area several times per week, finding companionship with other parents and providing safe indoor entertainment for her child during Sacramento's hot summers. Her death in the fire had occurred while she was trying to reach her son, who had been safely evacuated. But her maternal instincts had kept her spirit bound to the place where she had spent so many happy hours caring for her child. Tommy Patterson's story was the most heartbreaking. He had been visiting the mall with his grandparents to shop for his 8th birthday party, and the toy store had been his favorite destination during family outings. His death during the fire evacuation had occurred just hours before his birthday celebration, and his spirit remained in the mall because it was where his happiest childhood memories had been created. Margaret Vasquez had worked in the cosmetics department for 15 years and had considered her co-workers to be her closest friends. She had often stayed late to help with inventory or special events because she loved the social atmosphere of retail work. When she died alone during an overnight shift, her spirit remained connected to the workplace that had been the center of her social world. Frank Thompson had been a maintenance worker who took pride in keeping the mall's mechanical systems running smoothly. He had worked in the building for over a decade and knew every corner, pipe, and electrical circuit. His accidental death while repairing an escalator had left his spirit attached to the infrastructure he had maintained for so many years. Dorothy Kim had been a devoted customer who shopped at the mall several times per week, not because she needed merchandise, but because she enjoyed the social interaction with sales clerks and the activity of browsing through stores. The mall had been her primary social outlet after retirement, and when she died while shopping alone, her spirit remained in the environment where she had felt most engaged with the world. What all of these spirits had in common was that the mall had been their primary source of social connection and community engagement during their final years of life. For them, retail spaces weren't just places to buy merchandise. They were social environments that provided human interaction, entertainment, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because what I learned about the decline of retail culture and its impact on community connections reveals why places like this mall become haunted by people who have nowhere else to go. The spirit's attachment to the mall reflected a broader social phenomenon that I hadn't fully understood before this experience. For many Americans, especially elderly people and those without extensive social networks, shopping malls serve as community centers that provide social interaction, entertainment, and a sense of connection to the broader culture. When these retail spaces die, the people who depended on them for social engagement lose crucial sources of human connection. The supernatural activity I had been witnessing wasn't random or malicious. It was the desperate attempt of isolated souls to maintain the social relationships and community connections that had been central to their lives. They were recreating the retail environment, because it was the only social context they had known, and they were trying to preserve a form of community that had been destroyed by economic forces beyond their control. This realization made me understand why the entities had been so focused on commercial activities, arranging merchandise displays, operating checkout procedures, and maintaining the acoustic environment of a busy shopping center. They weren't trying to frighten people away from the mall. They were trying to keep it alive as a social space where community connections could continue to exist, even after death. As I spent my final hours in the mall, I tried to provide the spirits with the social interaction they craved. I walked through their recreated retail environments, acknowledging their displays and arrangements, and engaging in the type of casual conversation that had probably been the highlight of their days when they were living. The response was incredibly positive. The supernatural activity became more organized and purposeful, as if they were finally able to engage in the social behaviors that had given their lives meaning. But I also realized that my departure would leave them alone again, cut off from the human interaction that they desperately needed to maintain their sense of identity and connection. The elimination of the security position meant that no one would be in the mall during overnight hours to provide the social contact that kept these spirits grounded and purposeful. Let me know in the comments if you want me to share more about what happened to the mall after I left, because the fate of these trapped spirits reveals a deeper truth about what we owe to the souls who remain attached to the places we abandon. Paragraph 5, 2,000 words. I submitted my resignation effective immediately after that third night, but I couldn't simply walk away from the spirits who had shared their stories with me. Over the following weeks, I researched everything I could find about helping earthbound souls find peace and move on from their attachment to physical locations. What I learned was both hopeful and deeply concerning about the nature of unresolved spiritual attachments. According to paranormal researchers and spiritual counselors, spirits become trapped in locations when their emotional connections to those places are stronger than their readiness to accept death and transition to whatever comes next. The mall spirits weren't being held by malevolent forces or supernatural curses. They were choosing to remain because the retail environment represented their primary source of identity, purpose, and social connection during life. The solution, theoretically, would be to help them understand that they could maintain their sense of community and social engagement without being bound to a dying shopping mall. But this would require ongoing human interaction and spiritual guidance that I wasn't qualified to provide, and that the mall's management was unwilling to support for obvious business reasons. I contacted several paranormal investigation groups and spiritual counselors who specialized in helping trapped souls find peace, but their responses were discouraging. Most were focused on dramatic hauntings that involved malevolent spirits or dangerous supernatural activity. The quiet desperation of retail-attached souls didn't fit the sensational profile that attracted media attention or funding for intervention efforts. The few experts who were willing to consider helping explained that cases like the mall spirits often required months or years of patient counseling work to resolve. The spirits would need to be gradually weaned from their attachment to the physical retail environment, while being helped to develop new sources of identity and purpose that didn't depend on commercial activities. This type of long-term spiritual intervention was expensive, time-consuming, and had no guarantee of success. Meanwhile, the mall continued its decline toward complete abandonment. Within 2 months of my resignation, 3 more anchor stores announced their closures, reducing the center's occupancy to less than 30%. The reduced foot traffic during daytime hours meant that the spirits had even fewer opportunities for the social interaction that sustained their continued existence in the retail environment. I began visiting the mall as a regular customer during its operating hours, hoping to provide some form of ongoing social contact for the spirits. What I discovered during these visits was both heartening and heartbreaking. The supernatural activity that had been so intense during my overnight security shifts was also occurring during regular business hours, but at much lower levels of intensity. Store employees and customers occasionally reported unusual experiences: mannequins that seemed to change position, electronic systems that activated spontaneously, temperature fluctuations in specific areas, and the sense of being observed while shopping in certain sections of the mall. But these phenomena were subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence, imagination, or normal building quirks by people who weren't specifically looking for supernatural activity. The spirits had learned to coexist with the living customers and workers, finding ways to satisfy their need for social interaction through subtle influences on the retail environment. They were getting some of the human contact they craved, but it wasn't enough to fully sustain their spiritual well-being, and the mall's continued decline meant that even this limited social interaction was disappearing. During one of my daytime visits, I encountered Maria Santos, a woman in her 70s who had been a regular customer at the mall for over 15 years. She was sitting alone in the food court, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the sparse crowd of afternoon shoppers with obvious sadness. "This place used to be so alive," she told me when I sat down at her table and struck up a conversation. "I came here every day to walk and meet friends. Now most of my friends are gone, and soon this place will be gone too. I don't know where I'll go for company when that happens." Maria's situation was nearly identical to what Henry Morrison must have experienced before his death in the fire. She was an isolated elderly person who depended on the mall for social interaction and community connection, and the retail center's decline was eliminating her primary source of human contact. If she died while still emotionally attached to the mall as her social lifeline, she would very likely become another earthbound spirit trapped in the abandoned retail environment. This realization made me understand that the mall's supernatural infestation was not a historical problem that could be resolved through spiritual intervention. It was an ongoing process that would continue as long as socially isolated people used the retail environment as their primary source of community connection. Each person who died while emotionally dependent on the mall as a social space would potentially become another trapped spirit unable to move on to whatever comes after death. The broader implications of this pattern were deeply disturbing. As traditional retail culture continues to decline due to online shopping and economic changes, thousands of shopping malls across America are facing closure or abandonment. The people who have depended on these retail spaces for social interaction, elderly individuals, unemployed or underemployed people, parents with small children, and others who lack extensive social networks, are losing crucial sources of human connection. If even a small percentage of these socially isolated individuals die while still emotionally attached to retail environments that served as their primary social outlets, the result could be a nationwide epidemic of shopping mall hauntings. Abandoned retail spaces could become supernatural gathering places for spirits who are unable to find peace because the community connections that gave their lives meaning have been destroyed by economic forces. 3 months after my resignation, I received a call from Patricia, the security company dispatcher who had monitored the supernatural activity during my brief employment at the mall. She told me that the mall management had decided to install motion-activated cameras throughout the building to reduce security costs, and the overnight footage was revealing extensive supernatural activity that occurred when no human beings were present in the building. "Jake, I thought you should know that whatever was happening when you worked there has gotten much more intense," Patricia told me. "The cameras are picking up figures moving through the corridors, lights turning on and off in patterns, and sounds that don't match anything we've ever seen in other retail security accounts. Management is trying to keep it quiet, but word is getting out among the security industry that this place is seriously haunted." The escalation of supernatural activity after the elimination of human presence during overnight hours confirmed my understanding that the spirits needed social interaction to maintain their emotional stability. Without the security guard providing some form of human contact, they had become more desperate and dramatic in their attempts to attract attention and maintain their connection to the world of the living. Patricia also told me that several potential security contractors had refused to take over the mall account after reviewing the documented supernatural activity. The building was developing a reputation within the professional security industry as being unsafe for lone workers, which would make it increasingly difficult for the mall to maintain any form of overnight protection or monitoring. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happened when the mall finally closed completely, because the fate of the trapped spirits reveals a terrifying truth about what happens when we abandon the places where souls have found their only sense of home and community. 6 months after my resignation, the Westfield Shopping Center closed permanently. The few remaining stores relocated to other retail locations, and the building was sold to a development company that planned to demolish it and build a residential complex on the site. The closure was covered in local media as a typical example of retail industry decline, with no mention of the supernatural phenomena that had been documented by security personnel. But I knew that the closure would trap the spirits permanently in a building that would no longer serve any social or commercial purpose. Without the possibility of human interaction that had sustained them during the mall's operational years, they would be left alone in an empty building with nothing but memories of the community connections that had once given their existence meaning. I tried to contact paranormal researchers, spiritual counselors, and local religious organizations about the need for intervention before the building was demolished, but the response was uniformly discouraging. No one was willing to invest the time, money, and effort required to help a group of harmless retail-attached spirits find peace and move on from their earthbound existence. The demolition of the mall began 8 months after its closure. I drove by the site several times during the demolition process, wondering what would happen to spirits who were attached to a physical location that was being destroyed. Would they be released from their earthbound existence when their anchor point was eliminated? Or would they be left confused and displaced, searching for a retail environment that no longer existed? I never found out the answer to that question, but I did notice that other shopping malls in the Sacramento area began experiencing unusual activity after the Westfield Center was demolished. Security guards at similar retail locations reported phenomena that sounded remarkably familiar: footsteps in empty corridors, mannequins that moved on their own, Pennsylvania systems that activated spontaneously, and the sense of being watched by invisible presences. It's possible that the spirits who had been trapped in the demolished mall found their way to other retail environments where they could continue their desperate search for the social connections and community engagement that death had taken away from them. Or perhaps the destruction of their anchor point had released them to move on to whatever comes after earthbound existence. But I suspect that what really happened was simpler and more tragic. The spirits probably dissipated when their physical anchor point was destroyed, not moving on to a peaceful afterlife, but simply ceasing to exist in any meaningful form. Their attachment to the retail environment that had given their lives purpose had been so strong that they couldn't survive its elimination, even in death. The demolition of the Westfield Shopping Center removed a haunted building from the landscape, but it also erased the final traces of people who had found their only sense of community and belonging in a retail environment that society had decided was no longer economically viable. Their stories, their desperate need for human connection, and their tragic inability to find peace after death became just another casualty of American retail culture's decline. Today, when I drive past the residential complex that was built on the site where the mall once stood, I think about Henry Morrison, Lisa Chen, Tommy Patterson, Margaret Vasquez, Frank Thompson, and Dorothy Kim. They were real people who lived full lives, formed meaningful relationships, and found joy and purpose in the social environments that shopping malls provided during the golden age of American retail culture. Their deaths were tragic, but their spiritual attachment to the mall reflected something beautiful about human nature: the fundamental need for community, social interaction, and shared experiences that give life meaning. The fact that they couldn't find peace after death says less about supernatural forces and more about our society's failure to provide adequate social support for isolated individuals who depend on commercial spaces for human connection. The mall may be gone, but the social problems that created those trapped spirits remain. Across America, there are thousands of shopping centers facing closure and millions of socially isolated people who depend on retail environments for community engagement. As these commercial spaces continue to disappear, we're not just losing shopping destinations, we're losing the social infrastructure that provides meaning, purpose, and human connection for some of our most vulnerable community members. The curse of the shopping mall wasn't supernatural in origin. It was the result of economic and social forces that create isolation, destroy community connections, and abandon the people who need them most. The spirits I encountered during my 3 nights as a mall security guard were trying to tell us something important about what we lose when we allow retail spaces to die without providing alternative sources of community and social engagement. Their message was simple but profound. Everyone deserves to belong somewhere, to feel connected to other people, and to have their need for social interaction acknowledged and respected. When we fail to provide these basic human necessities for the living, we create the conditions that can trap souls in earthbound existence even after death. That's the real horror of what I experienced in that cursed shopping mall. Not the supernatural phenomena, but the social abandonment that created them. The dead were only trying to preserve the community connections that the living had allowed to die, and their failure to find peace reflects our collective failure to ensure that every person has access to the social relationships that make life worth living. The mall is gone now, but the lesson remains. Until we address the epidemic of social isolation and community disconnection that characterizes modern American life, we'll continue to create the conditions that can trap souls in the places where they found their only sense of belonging, even after those places, and the people who inhabited them, have been forgotten by the rest of the world.